The scream that tore through the dusty afternoon air of White Oaks, New Mexico in 1878 was so raw with desperation that it stopped Patrick Whitmore dead in his tracks as he led his horse toward the livery stable. He had been riding for 3 days straight from Colorado. His muscles ached, his throat was parched, and all he wanted was a cold beer and a soft bed. But that sound made every instinct in his body snap to attention, like a rattlesnake coiling to strike. Patrick was 26 years old, tall and lean, with sun-darkened skin, and eyes the color of whiskey held up to lamplight. He had spent the last 8 years working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, breaking horses for ranchers who paid well, and occasionally taking jobs that required a steady hand, and a man who knew how to keep his mouth shut. He was not the kind of man who went looking for trouble, but he had never been able to walk away from someone in genuine distress either, and that scream was about as distressed as a human voice could get. The sound had come from a large house at the end of Main Street, a 2-story structure painted white but graying with neglect, with a peaked roof and narrow windows that stared out at the street like suspicious eyes. Patrick tied his horse to a post and moved closer, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the street was mostly empty, except for a few locals who seemed to be deliberately ignoring the sounds coming from the house. Another cry rang out, this one forming words he could barely make out. "Please, somebody help me, please!" Patrick's jaw tightened. He approached an old man sitting on a bench outside the general store, whittling a piece of wood with studied concentration. "Whose house is that?" Patrick asked, nodding toward the source of the screams. The old man did not look up. "That would be the Cartwright place. Best keep walking, stranger. There's someone screaming for help in there. That would be Miss Grace Cartwright. Been locked up there for near about a week now." The old man finally met Patrick's eyes, and there was a mixture of shame and resignation in his weathered face. Her father's idea. She refused to marry Silas Drummond, the banker's son, and old Henry Cartwright decided to teach her a lesson about obedience. Locked her in the attic and said she will stay there until she comes to her senses. Patrick felt heat rise in his chest that had nothing to do with the New Mexico sun. And nobody's done anything about it? The old man shrugged. Henry Cartwright owns half the businesses in this town. Silas Drummond's father owns the other half. Nobody wants to cross them. Besides, folks around here figure it's a family matter. How a man handles his daughter's disobedience is his own business. "That's not disobedience," Patrick said quietly, his voice hard as iron. "That's imprisonment." He did not wait for a response. He crossed the street in long strides, his heart pounding with a righteous anger that made his vision sharpen and his thoughts crystallize. He had seen plenty of injustice in his years roaming the territories, had witnessed things that made his stomach turn, but there was something about the desperation in that woman's voice that cut right through him. The front door was locked. Patrick pounded on it with the side of his fist, hard enough to rattle the frame. "Open up! I know you have someone locked in there." There was no answer, but he heard movement inside. He pounded again, harder this time. Finally, the door cracked open and a man peered out, middle-aged and soft around the middle, with thinning hair and small, mean eyes. "What do you want?" "I want you to let that woman out of the attic." Henry Cartwright's face flushed red. "That's my daughter, and she's learning a valuable lesson about respecting her father's wishes. Now, get off my property before I call the sheriff." "Call him," Patrick said evenly. "I would be interested to hear him explain why he thinks it's legal to imprison someone for refusing a marriage proposal." "She's my daughter," Henry repeated, as if that explained everything. "I have the right to discipline her as I see fit. She'll marry Silas Drummond when she's ready to be reasonable, and until then, she can think about her foolishness in the attic. Now leave, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing." He tried to close the door, but Patrick's boot was already in the frame. "I'm not leaving until she's free." Henry's face went from red to purple. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, stranger. I can make your life very difficult in this town." "I'm just passing through," Patrick said. "I do not plan to stay, but I'm not leaving while there's a woman screaming for help." They stared at each other for a long moment, and then Henry made a mistake. He tried to shove the door closed and reach for something behind it at the same time. Patrick did not wait to see if it was a weapon. He threw his shoulder against the door, sending Henry stumbling backward, and stepped inside. The house was dim and stuffy, smelling of old tobacco and older anger. Henry was scrambling for a shotgun propped against the wall, but Patrick was faster. He grabbed the weapon and ejected the shells in one smooth motion, then tossed the empty gun across the room. "Where's the attic?" he demanded. Henry's expression had gone from angry to calculating. "You're making a serious mistake. Silas Drummond will have you run out of town, or worse." "The attic," Patrick repeated. "Now." Another scream came from above, weaker this time, as if the woman was running out of strength. Patrick did not wait for Henry to answer. He headed for the staircase and took the steps two at a time. The second floor had several doors, all closed, but there was a narrow door at the end of the hallway that looked different from the others. He tried the handle and found it locked. "Miss," he called through the door, "can you hear me?" There was a moment of silence and then a voice, hoarse and trembling. Yes, I can hear you. Please help me. I have been up here for 6 days. There's barely any water, and he only brings bread once a day. Please." Patrick examined the lock. It was sturdy, but the door frame was old wood. "Stand back from the door," he instructed. "I'm going to break it open." He heard her move away, and then he stepped back himself and kicked hard, right next to the lock. The frame splintered but held. He kicked again, throwing all his weight behind it, and this time the door burst inward with a crack like a gunshot. The attic was like stepping into an oven. The heat was suffocating, trapped under the peaked roof with no ventilation except one small window that barely opened. The space was cramped and filled with old furniture and trunks, and in the corner, crumpled on the floor, was a young woman. Grace Cartwright was 22 years old, though at that moment she looked like someone who had aged a decade in less than a week. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face. Her dress was rumpled and stained with sweat, and her lips were cracked from dehydration. But her eyes, when they met Patrick's, were still bright with determination and intelligence. And in that first moment, something passed between them that neither could have named, but both felt like a lightning strike. "You came," she whispered. "I did not think anyone would come." Patrick crossed to her in 3 strides and knelt down, pulling his canteen from his belt. "Drink slowly," he said, holding it to her lips. "Not too much at once." She drank greedily, and he had to pull the canteen away to keep her from making herself sick. "Easy," he said gently. "There's plenty more. Let's get you out of here first." He helped her to her feet, and she swayed, her legs weak from days of confinement. Without thinking, Patrick scooped her up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and he felt a fresh surge of anger at the man who would do this to his own daughter. "I can walk," Grace protested weakly, but she did not struggle in his arms. "Save your strength," Patrick told her. He carried her down the narrow stairs from the attic and into the hallway. Henry was waiting at the bottom of the main staircase, and he was not alone. A younger man stood beside him, well-dressed in a suit that looked absurdly out of place in the dusty frontier town. He had slicked back hair and a weak chin, and his eyes fixed on Grace with a possessive hunger that made Patrick's skin crawl. "Put her down," the younger man said. His voice was high and nasal. "Grace is my intended bride, and you have no right to interfere." "I'm not your intended anything, Silas," Grace said, and despite her weakened state, her voice was strong. "I told you no. I told my father no. I will never marry you." Silas's face twisted with anger and something uglier. "You do not have a choice. Your father and mine have an arrangement. You are going to marry me, and that's the end of it. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can come down from that attic and start acting like a proper lady." "She's not going back in that attic," Patrick said flatly. "And she's not marrying anyone she does not want to marry." "This is none of your concern," Henry said. "This is a private family matter, and you are trespassing. If you do not leave immediately, I will have you arrested." "Then arrest me," Patrick said, "but I'm taking her with me first." He started down the stairs, Grace still cradled in his arms. Henry and Silas moved to block his path, and for a moment, Patrick thought it might come to violence. Then Grace spoke up, her voice ringing through the hallway with surprising strength. "If you try to stop him, I will tell everyone in this town exactly what you did to me. I will tell them how you locked me in that attic with barely any food or water in the middle of summer. I will tell them how you tried to force me into marriage by breaking my will. And I will make sure that every newspaper from here to Santa Fe knows the name Henry Cartwright and exactly what kind of man he is." Henry's face went white. "You would not dare. You would ruin your own reputation." "I have no reputation left to ruin," Grace said bitterly. "You saw to that when you locked me up like a criminal. But you and Silas, you have businesses to run, reputations to maintain. How do you think people will react when they learn the truth? It was a bluff, Patrick realized, or at least partly a bluff. A woman's word carried little weight in most circles, and scandal would hurt her as much as them. But there was enough steel in Grace's voice and enough fear in Henry's eyes to suggest that she might just be stubborn enough to do it anyway. Consequences be damned. Henry and Silas stepped aside. Patrick carried Grace out of the house and into the blazing afternoon sun. A small crowd had gathered in the street, drawn by the commotion. He saw the old man from the general store, a few women whispering behind their hands, and several men watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to disapproval. He set Grace down carefully, keeping a hand on her elbow to steady her. She stood on shaking legs but held her head high, meeting the eyes of her neighbors with a defiant stare. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking up at Patrick. "I do not even know your name." "Patrick Whitmore, and you do not need to thank me." "Yes, I do. You risked yourself for a stranger. That's not something I will forget." A woman stepped forward from the crowd, older and gray-haired, with a kind face and shrewd eyes. "Grace Cartwright, you look half dead. Come with me. I will get you cleaned up and fed properly." Grace hesitated, glancing back at the house where her father and Silas stood in the doorway, watching with identically furious expressions. "It's all right," Patrick said softly. "They won not try anything with witnesses around. Go with her. Get your strength back." Grace nodded slowly and allowed the older woman to lead her away, but she looked back at Patrick one more time, and in her eyes was something more than gratitude. It was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet, but both felt pulling at them like a rope drawing taut. Patrick watched her go, then turned to face Henry Cartwright. The older man was still standing in his doorway, and now his expression had shifted from anger to cold calculation. "You have made an enemy today, Mr. Whitmore," Henry said quietly. "I do not forget slights, and I do not forgive them. You should leave White Oaks as soon as possible, while you still can." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." Patrick held his gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked back to his horse. His hands were shaking slightly with leftover adrenaline, and his mind was racing. He had come to White Oaks looking for nothing more than a place to rest for a night or two before moving on. Now he had made enemies of two of the town's most powerful men, and gotten himself tangled up in a situation that was none of his business. The smart thing would be to leave immediately, to ride out before Henry and Silas could make good on their threats. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Grace's face, saw the mixture of fear and determination in her expression, saw the way she had looked at him like he was something more than just another drifter passing through. He was not leaving. Not yet. The older woman who had taken Grace in turned out to be named Margaret Spencer, and she ran a boarding house on the edge of town. Patrick found them there an hour later, after he had stabled his horse and taken a room at a different establishment, one that looked less likely to refuse him service at Henry Cartwright's request. Margaret answered his knock and gave him a long, appraising look before stepping aside to let him in. "She has been asking for you," she said simply. Grace was sitting in the kitchen, cleaned up now and wearing a borrowed dress. Her hair was still damp from washing, hanging in dark waves around her shoulders, and there was more color in her face. She looked up when Patrick entered, and a smile transformed her features from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I was hoping you would come. I wanted to thank you properly." "You already thanked me," Patrick said, suddenly feeling awkward in the homey warmth of the kitchen. He was more comfortable sleeping under the stars than sitting at a table with lace curtains on the windows. "I thanked you for getting me out," Grace said, "but I did not thank you for believing me, for thinking that what was happening was wrong. Most people in this town seem to think my father has every right to do what he did." Patrick pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. Margaret bustled around putting a cup of coffee in front of him before disappearing discreetly into another room. "Your father does not have that right," Patrick said quietly. "Nobody does. You are not a child, and even if you were, what he did was cruel and dangerous. You could have died up there in that heat." Grace's hands tightened around her own coffee cup. "I think that was partly the point. Not to kill me, but to bring me as close to it as possible. To make me desperate enough to agree to anything. Silas Drummond has wanted to marry me since we were children, But I have always refused. My father owes money to Silas's father, the banker. A marriage would erase the debt and join our two families. It's all about business and money. It has nothing to do with love or compatibility or anything that should actually matter when two people get married. Why does Silas want to marry you so badly? Patrick asked, then immediately felt like an idiot. It was obvious why any man would want to marry her. Even bedraggled and exhausted, Grace Cartwright was striking, with dark eyes that seemed to see right through pretense, and a quick intelligence that showed in every word she spoke. Grace's smile turned bitter. Because I am the one thing he cannot buy or manipulate his way into having. Silas is used to getting everything he wants. He does not love me. I am not even sure he likes me, but he wants to own me, and my refusal has become a challenge to him. What will you do now? Patrick asked. The question seemed to deflate her. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her coffee. I do not know. I cannot go back to that house. But I have no money of my own, no skills that would let me earn a living. My father controlled everything. I am educated, I can read and write, and do figures better than most men. But no one in White Oaks is going to hire Henry Cartwright's rebellious daughter. I am trapped, just in a different way. Patrick found himself leaning forward before he fully thought through what he was about to say. You could leave, get out of White Oaks entirely, start fresh somewhere else. Where would I go? How would I get there? I told you I have no money. I have some money saved up, Patrick said. Enough to get you to Santa Fe or Albuquerque, somewhere bigger where you could find work and your father's name does not mean anything. I'm headed that direction anyway. Grace looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise, and something else, something that made Patrick's heart beat faster. You would do that? You do not even know me. I know enough, Patrick said simply. I know you would rather suffer in an attic than marry a man you do not love. I know you are strong enough to stand up to men who are used to getting their way. That's more than enough. For a long moment, Grace just stared at him. Then, slowly, she smiled. It was a real smile this time, not bitter or sad, and it lit up her entire face. You are either the kindest man I have ever met or the most foolish. Probably both, Patrick admitted, and was rewarded with a laugh that sounded like water over river stones. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. It's getting dark. Mr. Whitmore, I assume you have a place to stay for the night? Patrick took the hint and stood up. Yes, madam. I will be going now. Grace stood as well, and for a moment they were standing very close together in the small kitchen. She was tall for a woman, her eyes nearly level with his. Will I see you tomorrow? She asked softly. First thing in the morning, Patrick promised. We should talk more about your options, figure out what makes the most sense. All right, and Mr. Whitmore, Patrick, thank you. Again, for everything. He nodded, not trusting his voice, and left before he could do something foolish like reach out and touch her face, brush that dark hair back from her eyes, or any of the other things he suddenly found himself wanting to do. The night air was cool after the warmth of the kitchen, and Patrick walked slowly back to his boarding house, his mind churning. He was getting involved in something that could turn complicated very quickly, he knew that. But he also knew that walking away now would be impossible. Grace Cartwright had gotten under his skin in the space of a few hours, and he found himself thinking about her smile, her strength, the way she had stood up to her father, even when she had every reason to be broken. He was still thinking about her when he finally fell asleep, and she was the first thing on his mind when he woke up the next morning. Patrick made his way to Margaret's boarding house just after dawn, expecting a quiet breakfast and a serious conversation about Grace's future. What he found instead was chaos. Margaret met him at the door, her face tight with worry. She's gone, Margaret said without preamble. Grace, I woke up an hour ago and her room was empty. She left a note saying she did not want to cause me any more trouble and that she was going to try to make her own way. Foolish girl. She has no supplies, no horse, nothing. And I heard from my neighbor that Silas Drummond's been riding around town since before dawn with two of his father's ranch hands, looking for her. Patrick felt his stomach drop. Which direction did she go? The note did not say, but if she was trying to leave town, she would probably head south toward the main road. It is the only route to anywhere bigger than White Oaks. Patrick did not wait to hear more. He ran to the stable, threw a saddle on his horse with record speed, and rode out of town at a gallop. The landscape around White Oaks was all rolling hills covered in scrub brush and scattered pinyon pines, with the Jicarilla Mountains rising purple in the distance. The morning sun was just starting to heat up the air, promising another scorching day. Patrick scanned the terrain as he rode, looking for any sign of a woman on foot. He found her about 2 miles south of town, walking along the rutted wagon road, with determined but obviously tired steps. She was wearing the same borrowed dress from the night before, and carrying a small bundle that probably contained whatever few possessions she had been able to gather. When she heard his horse approaching, she spun around, her face showing fear until she recognized him. "Patrick," she said, and the relief in her voice made his chest ache. "I thought you might be Silas." He dismounted and walked toward her, fighting the urge to grab her and shake her for being so reckless. "What were you thinking? You cannot just walk out into the desert with no supplies, no water, nothing. You would have been dead in a day or two." Grace's chin came up stubbornly. "I was thinking that I have already caused enough trouble for people who were kind to me. Margaret could lose her business if my father decides to retaliate for helping me. You could get hurt if you keep standing between me and Silas. I needed to leave, and I needed to do it on my own." "That's very noble and very stupid," Patrick said bluntly. "Margaret chose to help you because she thought it was the right thing to do, same as me. You do not get to make that choice for us. And besides, you would not have made it 5 miles before you collapsed from heat exhaustion, or Silas caught up with you." "Then what do you suggest?" Grace demanded, her eyes flashing with frustration and fear. "I cannot go back to White Oaks. I cannot stay at Margaret's place forever, and I cannot impose on you any more than I already have. You said yourself you are just passing through. You have your own life to live, your own places to go. I'm not your responsibility, Patrick." "Maybe not," Patrick said quietly, "but I'm making you my responsibility anyway. Now get on the horse. We are going to do this right. We are going to get proper supplies, figure out a real plan, and then we are going to get you somewhere safe, together." Grace opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. Her eyes searched his face, and whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. "All right," she said finally, "but I want you to know that I'm not some helpless damsel. I just need a little help to get started, and then I can take care of myself." "I believe you," Patrick said, and meant it. He had no doubt that Grace Cartwright would survive and thrive once she was free of her father's control. She had the strength for it. She just needed a chance. He helped her up onto his horse, then swung up behind her. She stiffened for a moment at the intimacy of the position, his arms coming around her to hold the reins, but then she relaxed against him. Patrick tried to ignore how right it felt to have her there, tried to focus on the practical problems ahead of them, instead of the way her hair smelled like the soap Margaret had given her, or the way her body fit perfectly against his. They rode back to White Oaks, but Patrick avoided the main street and went straight to the general store through a back way. He left Grace with the horse and went inside to buy supplies, his mind working through the logistics. They could not stay in White Oaks. That much was clear. But where should they go? Santa Fe was the obvious choice, but it was also the first place Henry and Silas would look. Albuquerque was possible, or maybe even further, down to Las Cruces or across into Arizona territory. He was packing his purchases into saddlebags when he heard raised voices outside. His heart sank, and he moved quickly to the door. Silas Drummond was there, still mounted on his horse, with 2 rough-looking men flanking him. Grace stood her ground beside Patrick's horse, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I'm not going with you, Silas," she was saying, her voice steady despite the fear Patrick could see in her eyes. "I am leaving White Oaks, and there is nothing you can do to stop me." "Oh, I think there's plenty I can do," Silas said, and there was an ugly edge to his voice. "Your father has filed a complaint with the sheriff. He says you are not in your right mind, that you need to be returned to his care for your own safety. The law is on our side, Grace. You are coming back with me whether you like it or not." Patrick stepped out of the store, his hand instinctively dropping to the gun at his hip. "She's not going anywhere with you." Silas's eyes narrowed when he saw Patrick. "You again? I should have known. You are the one who has been filling her head with foolish ideas about running away. Well, it ends now. Grace is coming with me, and you are going to step aside, or my men here are going to make you step aside." The 2 ranch hands shifted in their saddles, and Patrick could see they were both armed. He was a decent shot, but he was also outnumbered and did not particularly want to start a gunfight in the middle of town. But He also was not going to let them take Grace back to that house, back to that attic. "There is a law against kidnapping," Patrick said evenly. "Grace is an adult woman. She has the right to go where she pleases. If you try to take her by force, you are breaking the law, not me." "It's not kidnapping when it's for her own good," Silas said dismissively. "Besides, who's going to stop us? You? You are one man against three." "Four," said a voice from behind Patrick. He turned to see the old man from the general store stepping out, a rifle held loosely in his hands. "I seen what that girl's father did to her," the old man said calmly. "Locked her up like an animal. That was not right. And I am not going to stand by and watch you drag her back there." "5," said another voice, and a shopkeeper from across the street emerged, also armed. "6," said Margaret, appearing from an alley with a shotgun that looked almost comically large in her hands, but was clearly well-maintained and ready to use. One by one, more people emerged from buildings and doorways. Not everyone in town, not even close to a majority, but enough. Enough people who had been troubled by what Henry Cartwright had done, who had felt guilty for their silence, and who were now ready to make a stand. Silas looked around at the growing crowd, and Patrick saw the calculation in his eyes. This was not going the way he had planned. He was used to intimidation working, used to his family's money and influence getting him what he wanted. He was not prepared for ordinary people to push back. "This is not over," Silas said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "My father is the banker in this town. He can ruin every single one of you if he wants to. You will regret this." "Maybe," the old man said, "but at least we will be able to look at ourselves in the mirror." Silas wheeled his horse around and rode off, his 2 men following. The crowd watched them go, and then, one by one, they began to disperse, going back to their shops and homes without expecting thanks or recognition. They had done what they thought was right, and that was enough. Margaret walked over to Patrick and Grace, still holding her shotgun. "You two need to leave now," she said quietly. "Today. Silas is going to go straight to his father, and they are going to come back with more men and more legal authority. The sheriff is in their pocket. You will not have another chance like this." Patrick nodded. "We were planning to leave anyway. Thank you, Margaret, for everything." The older woman looked at Grace, and her expression softened. "You take care of yourself, girl, and you do not let any man tell you what your life should be. You make your own choices, you hear me?" Grace hugged her impulsively, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I will never forget what you did for me. Never." Within an hour, they were ready to leave. Patrick had bought enough supplies for 2 people for at least a week, including a bedroll for Grace, extra water, dried food, and ammunition. He had also bought her a wide-brimmed hat to keep the sun off her face and a riding skirt that would be more practical than a dress. Grace had changed in Margaret's boarding house and emerged looking more ready for the trail ahead. They rode out of White Oaks heading east rather than south, a feint in case anyone was watching. Once they were out of sight of town, Patrick changed direction and headed southeast toward the Pecos River. He was not heading for any of the larger towns yet. First, they needed to get far enough away that Henry and Silas could not easily follow, and they needed time to figure out what came next. They rode hard for most of the day, stopping only briefly to rest the horse and drink water. Grace proved to be a capable rider, despite her inexperience with long distances. She did not complain about the heat or the pace, just kept her eyes on the horizon and rode with grim determination. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, Patrick started looking for a place to camp. He found a spot near a narrow creek, hidden from the trail by a stand of cottonwood trees. They dismounted, and Patrick set about making camp, while Grace tended to the horse, brushing him down and checking his hooves without needing to be asked. "You know horses," Patrick observed as he built a small fire. "My father used to breed them before he lost most of his money," Grace said. "I spent more time in the stables than in the house when I was growing up. The horses were better company than most of the people in my life." They ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, washed down with water from the creek. The night was cool after the heat of the day, and the sound of the water was soothing. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, more stars than Grace had ever seen from town, a vast river of light stretching across the heavens. "It is beautiful," she said softly, staring up at the sky. "I have never been out like this before, away from everything." Patrick looked at her instead of the stars. The firelight painted her face in warm gold and shadow, and he thought she was more beautiful than any constellation. "Are you scared?" he asked. Grace considered the question seriously. "A little. I do not know what is going to happen, where I am going to end up, how I am going to survive, but I am also more free than I have ever been in my life, so I think I am more excited than scared, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds around them. Then Grace spoke again, her voice softer. "Why are you doing this, Patrick? Really? You could have just walked away after you got me out of that attic. You could have left me with Margaret and continued on your way. But instead, you are risking yourself to help a stranger. Why?" Patrick stared into the fire, trying to find words for something he did not fully understand himself. "I have spent most of my adult life drifting," he said finally, "moving from job to job, town to town, never putting down roots, never getting too attached to anyone or anything. I told myself it was freedom, that I liked not being tied down. But the truth is, I think I was just running from the idea of caring too much, of being responsible for anyone but myself. When I heard you screaming in that attic, when I saw what they were doing to you, something in me woke up. I realized I was tired of being a man who just passes through other people's lives without leaving a mark. I wanted to do something that mattered. I wanted to be someone who stands up and helps, not someone who walks away because it is easier." Grace reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm and calloused from the day's riding, and the touch sent electricity through Patrick's whole body. "You are that person," she said quietly. "You are a good man, Patrick Whitmore. I knew it the moment you broke down that attic door." He turned to look at her, and in that moment, with the firelight dancing in her eyes and her hand in his, Patrick knew that he was falling in love with her. It was too fast, too crazy. They barely knew each other, but it was also as real as anything he had ever felt, a certainty that settled into his bones like the rightness of breathing. "Grace," he started, but she shook her head. "I know," she said. "I feel it too. I do not know what to do about it, or if we should do anything about it. Everything is so complicated right now, and I do not want you to think I am just attaching myself to you because you rescued me. But I need you to know that when I look at you, I feel something I have never felt before. Like I am finally seeing what I have been looking for my whole life without knowing I was searching." Patrick lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Then we will figure it out," he said, "together, one day at a time. No pressure, no expectations. We will just see where the trail leads." Grace smiled, and then, before Patrick could react, she leaned in and kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, a question more than a statement. But when Patrick kissed her back, when his hand came up to cup her face and he poured all of his confused, overwhelming feelings into that kiss, it became something more. It became a promise, a beginning, a door opening onto possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine just days before. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. Grace laughed, a little breathless, a little giddy. "Well," she said, "that was probably not the most sensible thing I have ever done." "No," Patrick agreed, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "But it might have been the best." They talked late into the night, the conversation ranging from serious to silly and back again. Grace told him about her childhood, about her mother who had died when she was 12, about the slow decline of her father's fortunes, and the corresponding increase in his bitterness and controlling behavior. Patrick told her about his own family, about growing up on a small ranch in Texas, about losing his parents to fever when he was 18, and striking out on his own rather than trying to keep the failing ranch going. "I think we are both running from something," Grace said thoughtfully. "You from the pain of losing your family and your home. Me from a father who wanted to control every aspect of my life. Maybe that is why this feels so right. We understand each other's need for freedom." "Maybe," Patrick said. "Or maybe we just found each other at exactly the right time." They finally settled down to sleep, Grace in her new bedroll and Patrick in his, maintaining a respectable distance despite the magnetic pull between them. Patrick lay awake for a long time, listening to Grace's breathing slow and even out as she fell asleep, and thinking about how much his life had changed in the course of a single day. He had set out from Colorado with no particular destination in mind, following the same pattern he had been following for years. And now he had a destination, or at least a companion for the journey, and it felt like his life had finally found the direction it had been lacking. They traveled for 5 more days, moving generally southeast and then south, following the Pecos River when they could, and cutting across open country when they had to. The days were hot and the nights were cool, and they fell into an easy rhythm with each other. Grace proved to be adaptable and resilient, never complaining about the hardships of trail life. She learned quickly how to make camp efficiently, how to cook over an open fire, how to read the landscape for water and shelter. And in the evenings, after they had eaten and the fire was burning low, they talked about everything and nothing, about their hopes and fears, their dreams for the future, the things that made them laugh and the things that made them angry. Patrick learned that Grace had wanted to be a teacher, but her father had forbidden it, saying it was not appropriate for a woman of her station. Grace learned that Patrick had once wanted to own his own ranch, but had convinced himself that he was better off without the responsibility and the ties that came with it. "Maybe you could do both," Grace suggested one night as they lay on their backs looking up at the stars. "Own a ranch but live life on your own terms, not because you have to, but because you choose to." "Maybe," Patrick said, "but it would take money I do not have, and even if I did, I am not sure I would know how to settle down anymore. I have been moving for so long, it is the only life I know." Grace rolled onto her side to look at him, propping her head up on her hand. "I think you are selling yourself short. You strike me as someone who could do anything he set his mind to. The question is not whether you could settle down, it is whether you want to." It was a fair point, and Patrick did not have a good answer for it. The truth was, the idea of settling down had always felt like giving up, like admitting defeat. But lying there under the stars with Grace beside him, he found himself thinking that maybe it would not be giving up at all. Maybe it would be choosing something better. On the 6th day, they reached the town of Roswell, a growing settlement on the Pecos River. It was bigger than White Oaks, with more businesses and more opportunities. And crucially, it was far enough away that Henry Cartwright's influence did not extend there. They rode into town in the early afternoon, dusty and tired, but also feeling a sense of accomplishment. They had made it. They were far enough away from White Oaks that Grace could start building a new life without fear of being dragged back to her father's house. Patrick found them a respectable boarding house run by a stern-looking widow named Mrs. Henderson, who took one look at Grace's exhausted face and immediately softened. "You look like you have been through the ringer, dear," Mrs. Henderson said. "Let me show you to a room where you can get cleaned up, and I will have my girl draw you a bath." Grace looked at Patrick, suddenly uncertain. "I still do not have any money. I cannot pay for a room." "I will take care of it," Patrick said. "You can pay me back once you find work, if it makes you feel better." "It does," Grace admitted. "I do not want to be in anyone's debt, even yours." "You are not in my debt," Patrick said firmly. "But if you need to think of it that way to accept the help, then fine. We can settle up later." Grace followed Mrs. Henderson upstairs, and Patrick secured his own room, then went to find the local land office. If they were going to stay in Roswell for a while, he needed to scout out opportunities. He had enough money saved to get by for a few months, but after that he would need work. And if Grace was going to make a life here, she would need options too. The land office was a small building near the center of town, and the clerk behind the desk was a young man with ink-stained fingers and a friendly demeanor. Patrick introduced himself and asked about prospects in the area. "Are you looking to buy land or just find work?" the clerk asked. "Both, potentially. I have experience with horses and cattle, and I am good with my hands. I can build, repair, break horses, whatever needs doing." The clerk nodded thoughtfully. "There is always work for a man with those skills. The ranches around here are expanding, and they are always looking for good hands. As for land, there are some parcels available under the Homestead Act if you are willing to put in the work to prove up a claim. It's hard work, but it is a way to own your own place if you are serious about settling." Patrick took the information the clerk offered and spent the next hour walking around Roswell, getting a feel for the town. It was rougher than White Oaks in some ways, with more saloons and a more transient population. But it also felt more alive, more full of possibility. This was a place where a person could reinvent themselves, where the past did not have to define the future. He returned to the boarding house as the sun was setting and found Grace sitting in the small parlor, looking cleaner and more rested than he had seen her since they left White Oaks. She had bought a new dress with money Mrs. Henderson had advanced her against future work, a simple blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. "You look beautiful," Patrick said, and meant it. Grace blushed. I feel human again. A real bed, a hot bath, clean clothes. It is amazing what a difference those things make. They had dinner together in the boarding house dining room, a simple but hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread. Afterward, they sat on the porch and watched the town settle down for the night. I talked to Mrs. Henderson about work, Grace said. She said she could use help with the laundry and the cooking, and she would give me room and board plus a small wage. It is not much, but it is a start. And she said she might know some families who need tutoring for their children. I could teach reading and mathematics in the evenings for extra money. That's great, Patrick said, genuinely pleased. See, you are already landing on your feet. Thanks to you, Grace said. I would not be here without you, Patrick. I would probably be back in that attic or worse. Patrick shook his head. You would have found a way. You are too stubborn to let them break you. Grace laughed. Maybe, but I'm glad I did not have to do it alone. She paused, then added more quietly, What about you? Are you going to stay in Roswell? It was the question Patrick had been avoiding asking himself. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to move on. He had helped Grace get to a place where she could start fresh. His job was done. There was no reason to stay, except the one reason that mattered more than all the practical considerations combined. He did not want to leave her. I am thinking about it, he said carefully. There is work here, and the clerk at the land office said there are homestead claims available if I wanted to try to start a ranch. I have been drifting for a long time. Maybe it is time to put down roots. Grace turned to look at him, and in the lamplight spilling from the windows, her eyes were luminous. Is that what you want? Or are you just saying that because of me? Patrick took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. I am saying it because of you, he admitted, but that does not make it any less true. Grace, I have been half alive for years, just going through the motions, pretending that freedom was the same thing as happiness. And then I met you, and suddenly I want things I have not let myself want in a decade. I want a home. I want a future. I want to wake up every morning knowing that I am building towards something instead of just running away from something. And I want to do all of that with you, if you will have me. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Patrick, we have known each other less than 2 weeks. Is that enough time to make this kind of decision? I do not know, Patrick said honestly. Maybe not, but I also know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. And I do not want to lose that because I was too cautious or too scared to take a risk. So I am asking you, Grace Cartwright, will you let me stay? Will you let me be part of your life while you are building your new start? We do not have to rush into anything. We can take our time, get to know each other better, but I need to know if you want me to stay. Grace leaned in and kissed him, soft and sweet. When she pulled back, she was definitely crying now, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she said. Yes. I want you to stay. I want that more than anything. They sat on that porch until late into the night, making plans and dreaming out loud about the future they might build together. It was too soon to talk about marriage, too soon to make promises they might not be able to keep. But it was not too soon to hope, to imagine, to believe that two damaged people who had found each other at exactly the right moment might be able to create something beautiful together. Patrick stayed in Roswell. He found work at a ranch about 5 miles outside of town, breaking horses for a cattleman named Dutch Reynolds, who paid well and did not ask too many questions about a man's past. The work was hard but satisfying, and Patrick threw himself into it with an energy he had not felt in years. Grace thrived at the boarding house, and word quickly spread that she was an excellent tutor. Within a month, she had 4 students she was teaching in the evenings and misses. Henderson was talking about expanding her small enterprise to include a proper school. Patrick and Grace saw each other every Sunday, his day off from the ranch. They would meet in town and spend the day together, walking along the river, sharing meals, talking about everything and nothing. And slowly, carefully, they built something real. They learned each other's habits and quirks, their strengths and weaknesses. They had their first real argument about a month in over something trivial that Patrick could not even remember later. But the important part was that they worked through it. They learned how to communicate, how to compromise, how to be partners rather than just 2 people caught up in the romance of their dramatic meeting. 3 months after arriving in Roswell, Patrick filed a homestead claim on a piece of land about 8 miles from town. It was not much, just 160 acres of grassland, with a small creek running through it, but it had potential. The land was good for grazing, and there was enough water for a small herd of cattle or horses. With 5 years of work, he could prove up the claim and own the land outright. He told Grace about it on a Sunday afternoon as they sat by the Pecos River watching the water flow past. "I am going to start building a house," he said. "Nothing fancy at first, just a small cabin. But eventually I want to build something real, a home." Grace looked at him, her expression unreadable. "That is a big commitment. Are you sure?" "I am sure," Patrick said. "I am done running, Grace. I want to build something that lasts." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Show me the land." They rode out the next Sunday, with Patrick borrowing a horse from Dutch Reynolds for Grace. The ride took them through open grassland and past scattered stands of cottonwoods, and when they topped a small rise and Patrick pointed out the boundaries of his claim, Grace sucked in her breath. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "It will be better when there is a house on it," Patrick said, "and maybe a barn and some corrals. I was thinking I could focus on breeding horses. There is always a market for good stock, and it is something I know how to do well." Grace dismounted and walked across the land, her fingers trailing through the tall grass. Patrick watched her, his heart in his throat, knowing that what he was really asking was whether she could see herself here, whether she could imagine this place as home. Finally, Grace turned back to him, and she was smiling. "When do we start building?" Patrick's heart soared. "We?" "We," Grace confirmed. "If you will have me as a partner, that is. I have been saving my money from tutoring, and I am good with figures. I can help you plan the finances, figure out what stock to buy and when. And I can help with the building, too. I told you, I spent my childhood around horses and ranches. I know how to work." Patrick dismounted and walked to her, taking both her hands in his. "Grace Cartwright, are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am saying that I love you," Grace said, and her voice was steady and sure. "I am saying that I want to build a life with you, on this land, in this territory. I am saying that I want to be your partner in every sense of the word. Even though we have only known each other a few months. Even though," Grace confirmed, "some people know each other for years and never really see each other. We have seen each other from the start, Patrick. We know what we want, and we know we want it together. So, yes, even though it has only been a few months, I'm sure." Patrick kissed her then, pouring all of his love and hope and gratitude into it. When they broke apart, both of them were grinning like fools. "Then I guess I should ask you properly," Patrick said. He dropped to one knee, right there in the tall grass, and looked up at her with his heart in his eyes. "Grace Cartwright, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and my partner, and the mother of the children I hope we will have? Will you build this life with me, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, until death do us part?" Grace did not hesitate. "Yes, yes, Patrick Whitmore, I will marry you. I will be your wife and your partner and everything else you just said. Yes to all of it." They were married a month later in a simple ceremony at the Roswell Church with Mrs. Henderson and Dutch Reynolds as witnesses. Grace wore a new dress she had sewn herself, pale yellow like sunshine, and Patrick wore his best shirt and a vest he had bought special for the occasion. The preacher was a circuit rider who happened to be passing through, and he gave them a blessing that was brief but heartfelt. Afterward, they had a small celebration at the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson had baked a cake, and Dutch brought a bottle of good whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion. A few of Grace's students and their parents came, and the old man from White Oaks who had stood up for them with his rifle showed up unexpectedly, having traveled all that way just to see them wed. "I wanted to make sure you two made it official," he said with a gap-toothed grin. "After all the fuss you caused leaving White Oaks, figured you owed it to us to make an honest woman of her." "I plan to spend the rest of my life making good on that promise," Patrick said, shaking the old man's hand. Grace hugged him. "Thank you for coming, and thank you for standing up for me when it mattered." "Hell, girl, you stood up for yourself," the old man said. "I just made sure nobody stopped you." They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, in the same room Grace had been renting for months. It was not fancy or exotic, but it was theirs, and when Patrick carried Grace over the threshold and closed the door behind them, it felt like the whole world narrowed down to just the two of them. They made love for the first time that night, tentative and tender and full of wonder. Neither of them was particularly experienced, but they learned each other with patience and care, and if it was not perfect, it was still beautiful. It was a claiming and a promise, a physical expression of the commitment they had made to each other. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Grace's head on Patrick's chest, his hand stroking through her dark hair. "I never thought I could be this happy," Grace said softly. "When I was locked in that attic, I thought my life was over. I thought I would either break and marry Silas or I would die. I never imagined this, freedom and love and a future worth living for." "I never imagined it either," Patrick admitted. "I thought I would just keep drifting forever, never connecting with anyone or anything. And then you screamed, and I came running, and my whole life changed." "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked. "Giving up your freedom for me?" Patrick tightened his arms around her. "I did not give up my freedom. I found something better. And I have never regretted a single moment, not even the hard parts. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Whitmore. I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt that." Grace lifted her head to kiss him, and then she smiled against his lips. "Grace Whitmore, I like the sound of that." "So do I," Patrick said. "So do I." They moved out to the homestead a week later, living in a tent while Patrick began work on the cabin. Grace helped when she could, between her tutoring jobs and helping Mrs. Henderson. But mostly she focused on earning money they could invest in the ranch. They needed lumber and nails and tools, and they needed livestock to start their herd. Dutch Reynolds helped them get started, selling Patrick a breeding pair of horses at a fair price, and throwing in some advice about bloodlines and training methods. By the end of their first year on the homestead, they had a small but sturdy cabin with 2 rooms, a barn big enough for half a dozen horses, and 3 mares with good pedigree that Patrick was training for sale. It was hard work, harder than anything either of them had done before. There were days when Patrick's back ached so badly he could barely straighten up, and days when Grace's hands were raw and bleeding from scrubbing laundry or helping to dig post holes. But they were building something together, and that made every difficulty worthwhile. They learned to work as a team, each of them bringing their own strengths to the partnership. Patrick had the physical skills and the knowledge of horses, while Grace had the business sense and the ability to negotiate prices that kept them from being cheated. Together, they made a formidable pair. Their first real test came in the winter of their second year. The snows came early and heavy, and they found themselves snowed in for nearly 2 weeks with dwindling supplies and horses to keep alive. Patrick worried constantly that they had made a mistake, that he had led Grace into a situation that might kill them both. But Grace never complained. She rationed their food carefully, kept the fire burning, and told stories to pass the long, dark hours. And when the snow finally melted and they were able to get into town for supplies, Patrick looked at his wife and realized that she was tougher than he had ever given her credit for. "You could have died out there," he said one night as they lay in bed, the wind howling outside. "I am sorry I put you through that." Grace turned to face him, her expression serious. "Patrick, listen to me. I chose this life. I chose you. And I would choose it all over again, even knowing what it would cost. Yes, that was hard. Yes, I was scared. But I was never sorry. Do you understand? This is the life I want. Hardships and all." Patrick pulled her close, his heart overflowing with love for this woman who had proven to be stronger and braver than he could have imagined. "How did I get so lucky?" "You did not get lucky," Grace said. "You made a choice to stop and help someone who needed it, and I made a choice to trust you and follow you. We made our own luck, Patrick. And we are going to keep making it, day by day, year by year." She was right, Patrick realized. They had not stumbled into happiness by accident. They had worked for it, fought for it, chosen it over and over again, and that made it all the more precious. By their 3rd anniversary, the ranch was thriving. Patrick had earned a reputation for breeding and training horses that were smart, tough, and reliable. Buyers came from as far as Santa Fe to purchase his stock, and he was able to command premium prices. Grace had given up tutoring to focus full-time on the ranch, managing the books and handling sales while Patrick did the training. And that year, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Patrick one evening as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over their land. She was nervous, Patrick could tell, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her apron. "Patrick, I have something to tell you," she said. He turned to look at her, concerned by her tone. "What is it? Is something wrong?" No, nothing's wrong. At least, I do not think so. But it is going to change things. She took a deep breath. I am going to have a baby. Our baby. You are going to be a father. For a moment, Patrick just stared at her, the words not quite processing. And then, suddenly he was on his feet, whooping with joy, picking Grace up and spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down. A baby, he kept saying. We are going to have a baby. Are you happy? Grace asked, as if there could be any doubt. Happy? Patrick set her down carefully and cupped her face in his hands. Grace, I am beyond happy. I am terrified and thrilled and grateful, and about 100 other things all at once. A baby. Our baby. When? Late spring, I think. Maybe early summer. I am not far along yet. Patrick kissed her, soft and reverent. Thank you, he said. Thank you for giving me this, for giving us this. You are going to be an amazing father, Grace said, and she sounded completely certain. I am going to try, Patrick promised. God knows I am going to try. The pregnancy was mostly smooth, though Grace suffered from morning sickness for the first few months that left her exhausted and miserable. Patrick took over more of the household duties, cooking meals that would not turn her stomach and bringing her water when she could not keep anything else down. He worried constantly, terrified that something would go wrong, but Grace remained calm and confident. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, she reminded him when he hovered too much. I am going to be fine. We are both going to be fine. In late May of 1881, Grace went into labor. Mrs. Henderson had come out to the ranch a few days earlier to help with the birth, and she sent Patrick outside when Grace's pains started coming close together. You will just be in the way, she said firmly. Go chop wood or mend a fence or something useful. We will call you when there's a baby to meet. Patrick spent the longest hours of his life pacing outside the cabin, listening to Grace's cries and feeling utterly helpless. Dutch Reynolds had ridden out to check on them and ended up sitting with Patrick, passing a bottle of whiskey back and forth. It is always like this, Dutch said philosophically. Women do all the hard work, and men just wait and worry. Nature's joke on us. How do you stand it? Patrick asked. Dutch had 5 children with his wife, and Patrick could not imagine going through this 5 times. You stand it because you love them, Dutch said simply, and because at the end, you get to meet your child. Trust me, it is worth every second of terror. Finally, just as the sun was rising, painting the eastern sky pink and gold, Patrick heard a new sound, the thin, outraged wail of a newborn baby. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, tired but smiling. You can come in now, Father. You have a son. Patrick nearly fell over himself getting through the door. Grace was propped up in bed, looking exhausted but radiant, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. Patrick approached slowly, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst right out of his chest. Patrick, meet your son, Grace said softly, adjusting the blanket so he could see the baby's face. Patrick looked down at the impossibly small person in his wife's arms and felt his entire world shift. The baby had a thatch of dark hair and a red wrinkled face, and he was the most beautiful thing Patrick had ever seen. Can I hold him? Patrick asked, his voice rough. Grace smiled and carefully transferred the baby into Patrick's arms. He was so light, so fragile, and Patrick held him like he might break. Hello, son, Patrick whispered. I am your papa, and I promise you, I am going to do everything in my power to give you a good life, to keep you safe and loved and happy. You are already the best thing I have ever been part of creating. The baby yawned, revealing a pink mouth and tiny tongue, and Patrick felt tears running down his face. He had not cried in years, not since he was a boy, but looking at his son, he could not hold it back. What should we name him? Grace asked. They had discussed names for months without settling on anything definite, but looking down at his son now, Patrick knew exactly what felt right. Peter, he said. Peter James Whitmore, after my father and your grandfather. Grace smiled. Peter, I like that. Hello, Peter. Welcome to the world. The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights and constant worry and overwhelming love. Peter was a healthy baby with a strong set of lungs, and he quickly established himself as the center of their universe. Patrick had never known he could love someone so fiercely, so completely. He would have died for Grace without hesitation, but Peter added a new dimension to that protective instinct. He would tear the world apart to keep his son safe. They adjusted to life as parents, learning as they went. Grace proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving, even when she was exhausted. Patrick learned to change nappies and soothe a crying baby and function on almost no sleep. And somehow, they made it work. The ranch continued to grow. Patrick hired a hand to help with the horses, a young man named Tom who was reliable and good with the animals. Grace managed to keep the books balanced while caring for Peter, though she admitted that it was a challenge juggling everything. "I do not know how mothers with multiple children do it," she said one night as they finally collapsed into bed after getting Peter to sleep. "One is exhausting enough." "You are doing beautifully," Patrick assured her. "You are an amazing mother and an amazing wife, and I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I am grateful every single day." Grace snuggled against him. "Flatterer. But I will take it." Life settled into a rhythm. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their son. Peter learned to walk, to talk, to ride a horse before he could read. He was a happy child, curious and fearless, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn determination. When Peter was 3, Grace became pregnant again. This time, she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy seemed easier somehow. She gave birth to a daughter in the spring of 1884, a tiny, perfect girl they named Penelope after Patrick's mother. "Now we have one of each," Grace said, holding her daughter, while Peter peered curiously at his new sister. "Our family feels complete," Patrick agreed. With 2 healthy children, a thriving ranch, and the love of his life by his side, he had everything he had never known he wanted. But life had one more twist in store for them. 5 years after leaving White Oaks, a letter arrived addressed to Grace. It had been forwarded through several post offices and was crumpled and travel-worn by the time it reached them. Grace opened it with shaking hands, her face going pale as she read. "What is it?" Patrick asked, concerned. "It is from a lawyer in Santa Fe," Grace said slowly. "My father died 3 months ago, heart failure, and he left everything to me." Patrick stared at her. "Everything? What was left of it anyway? The house in White Oaks, some debts, and apparently some investments that actually did well. The lawyer says there is money, Patrick, quite a bit of it, and it is all mine now." Grace sat down heavily, the letter falling from her hands. "I do not know how to feel about this. I hated him for what he did to me. I cut him out of my life completely, but he was still my father, and now he is gone, and I will never have the chance to tell him how his actions hurt me or to hear him apologize." Patrick knelt beside her chair and took her hands. "You are allowed to feel however you feel. You can be angry and sad and relieved all at the same time. Grief is complicated, especially when the relationship was complicated." "I do not think I want the house," Grace said. "I do not want to go back to White Oaks, not even to claim it. But the money could be useful. We could expand the ranch, buy more land, hire more hands. We could make sure Peter and Penelope have advantages we never had. Or we could donate it," Patrick suggested, "to a charity that helps women escape bad situations. A way of making something good come from what happened to you." Grace looked at him with shining eyes. "That is why I love you. You always know the right thing to say." She paused, thinking. "What if we did both? Used some of the money for the ranch and the children, and gave the rest to help other women who were trapped like I was?" "That sounds perfect," Patrick agreed. They traveled to Santa Fe to meet with the lawyer and settle the estate. It was Grace's first time back in New Mexico since leaving, and Patrick could see the tension in her shoulders as they approached the city. But she held her head high and dealt with everything that needed to be handled with quiet dignity. The investments turned out to be worth more than the lawyer had initially estimated. Henry Cartwright had, in his final years, made some surprisingly shrewd business decisions. After settling debts and legal fees, Grace was left with a sum large enough to change their lives significantly. True to their agreement, they used some of the money to buy additional land adjoining their homestead and to build a larger, more comfortable house. They hired 3 more hands and expanded their horse breeding operation. And they donated a substantial amount to a charitable organization in Santa Fe that helped women and children escape abusive situations. "This feels right," Grace said, as they signed the papers transferring the money. "Like I am taking something terrible that happened and turning it into something that might help other people. My father tried to break me, But instead, he gave me the resources to help make sure other women do not have to go through what I did. The lawyer, an older man with kind eyes, smiled at her. Your father would probably be furious if he knew what you were doing with this money, but I think it is exactly what you should be doing. He was a hard man, Mrs. Whitmore. I did business with him for years, but you are nothing like him. You have made something good of yourself, and that is the best revenge. They returned to the ranch with lighter hearts and fuller pockets. Life continued to be good, better than either of them had dared to hope during those desperate days when Patrick had broken down an attic door and carried Grace to freedom. Peter grew into a fine young man, smart and capable, with a gift for understanding horses that surpassed even his father's. Penelope was fearless and funny, keeping her parents on their toes with her endless questions and boundless energy. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Patrick and Grace took an evening to themselves, leaving the children with Tom and his wife. They rode out to the spot where Patrick had first shown Grace the land, where he had proposed to her all those years ago. The grass was tall and golden in the evening light, and the mountains were purple silhouettes against a sky painted pink and orange by the setting sun. They dismounted and stood together, looking out over the land they had built into a home. "Do you ever think about that day?" Patrick asked, "when I broke down the attic door?" "All the time," Grace admitted. "It is the day my life really began. Everything before that was just preparation, I think. All the pain and struggle and fear. It all led me to that moment when I heard your voice on the other side of that locked door. And then it led me here, to this life with you." "I think about it too," Patrick said. "I think about how close I came to just riding past that house. I was tired and hot, and all I wanted was a drink and a bed. If I had been 10 minutes earlier or later, if I had decided to go to a different stable, if I had ignored your cries like everyone else in that town did, none of this would exist. We would not be standing here. Peter and Penelope would not exist. It is terrifying how random it all was." "Or maybe it was not random at all," Grace suggested. "Maybe it was fate. Maybe we were always supposed to find each other, and that was just the way it happened." Patrick put his arm around her, pulling her close. "I like that version better." They stood there as the sun sank lower and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and closer by, they heard the horses in the pasture nickering to each other. It was peaceful and perfect, and Patrick felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. "I love you," he said. "I have said it 1,000 times, but I do not think I can ever say it enough. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Grace Whitmore. You gave me a home and a family and a reason to stop running. You gave me everything." Grace turned in his arms to face him, her face glowing in the last light of day. "And you gave me freedom. You gave me a chance to choose my own life. You showed me what real love looks like, not the twisted version my father tried to force on me. We gave each other everything, Patrick. That is what marriage is supposed to be." They kissed as the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, and it was as sweet and full of promise as that first kiss had been by a campfire years ago. The years continued to pass in a blur of work and love and growth. Peter grew into a young man who made his parents proud, taking on more and more responsibility for running the ranch. Penelope stunned everyone by announcing at age 15 that she wanted to be a doctor, and Grace and Patrick supported her ambition, even though it was almost unheard of for a woman in that time and place. "If anyone can do it, you can," Grace told her daughter. "Never let anyone tell you what you cannot do just because you are a woman. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I will not let you go through the same thing." By the time Patrick and Grace celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary, they had grandchildren on the way. Peter had married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring spread, and they were expecting their first child. Penelope was studying medicine in Philadelphia, one of the few schools that accepted women, and she wrote long letters home full of excitement about her studies. Patrick was in his late 40s now, with gray threading through his hair and lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. Grace had aged gracefully, her beauty deepening with time and experience. They sat together on the porch of their house, the same house they had built with their own hands and expanded over the years, and watched the sun set over land they owned free and clear. "I never thought I would make it to this point," Patrick admitted. "When I was younger, I lived hard and fast, never thinking about the future. I figured I would die young, probably doing something stupid. But here I am, about to be a grandfather, sitting on my own land with the love of my life beside me. It does not feel real sometimes. It is real, Grace assured him, taking his hand. Everything we built, everything we created, it is all real, and we did it together. That is what I am most proud of, Patrick. Not the ranch or the money or the success. I am proud that we have been partners in every sense of the word for 20 years. We have faced hard times and good times, and we have done it together. Patrick raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, the same gesture he had made that first night by the campfire. Here is to 20 more years, he said, and to whatever adventures we have left to live. To us, Grace agreed, always and forever. Their first grandchild was born in the summer of 1898, a healthy boy that Peter and his wife named Henry after Grace's father. When Grace first heard the name, she had mixed feelings, but Peter explained his reasoning. I know what grandfather did to you was terrible, Peter said, but he also gave you life, and his mistakes taught you how to be a better parent to me and Penelope. I want to take that name and make it mean something good. I want to show that people can overcome their pasts and create new legacies. Grace hugged her son, tears streaming down her face. You are a better person than I am, she said. But you are right. Let us make that name mean something worth celebrating. Patrick and Grace watched their family grow and thrive, and they counted their blessings every single day. They had built something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. The ranch would pass to Peter and eventually to his children. Penelope would blaze her own trail as one of the first female doctors in the Southwest, and the charitable organization they had founded with Henry Cartwright's money was helping women and children throughout the territory. On a crisp autumn evening in 1903, Patrick and Grace took one final ride out to the spot where it had all begun. Patrick was 51 now, Grace 47, and they were both feeling their age, but their love was as strong as ever, tempered by time and tested by hardship into something unbreakable. Do you have any regrets? Grace asked as they stood looking out over the land. Patrick thought about it seriously before answering. I regret that we did not meet sooner, he said finally, that we lost all those years when we could have been together. But I do not regret anything that happened after I broke down that attic door. Every choice we have made, every hardship we have faced, every joy we have celebrated, it all brought us here, and I would not change a single moment of it. Neither would I, Grace said softly. Even the darkest moments, even when I was locked in that attic thinking I would die there, it all led me to you, and that makes everything worth it. They rode back to the ranch as the stars came out, their horses walking side by side, their hands clasped between them. Behind them stretched 25 years of shared life, of love and struggle and triumph. Ahead of them stretched whatever time they had left, and they would face it the same way they had faced everything else. Together. Patrick Whitmore lived to be 73 years old, and he died peacefully in his sleep, with Grace holding his hand. He had lived to see 3 grandchildren grow to adulthood and to meet 2 great-grandchildren. He had built a ranch that was known throughout New Mexico for producing the finest horses in the territory, and most importantly, he had spent 52 years married to the woman he loved. Grace lived another 5 years after Patrick's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She spent her final years writing down their story, making sure that future generations would know how their family began, how a desperate scream had stopped a cowboy in his tracks, how breaking one lock had broken open both of their lives, how love could grow in the most unlikely circumstances. She wrote about the fear and the hope, the struggle and the joy, the moments of doubt and the certainty that came from finding the right person at the right time. And she ended her story with the words that had guided their entire marriage. We gave each other freedom, she wrote in her careful hand. We gave each other choice. We gave each other love that was freely given, not demanded or coerced. And in return, we received a life beyond anything either of us could have imagined. That is the legacy I want to leave, not the ranch or the money or the success. The legacy of love that transforms, that heals, that makes all things possible. Grace Whitmore died on a summer evening in 1908, surrounded by her family with Patrick's name on her lips. She was buried beside him on the hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, under the wide New Mexico sky they both loved. Their children carried on their legacy. Peter ran the ranch with the same dedication and skill his father had shown. Penelope became a renowned doctor, specializing in helping women and children, carrying on her mother's mission in a different form. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren spread throughout the Southwest. Teachers and ranchers, doctors and business owners, each of them carrying forward the values Patrick and Grace had lived by. The ranch itself stayed in the family for 4 generations, a testament to the foundation Patrick and Grace had built, and the charitable organization they had founded continued to help women escape abusive situations, growing and expanding to serve thousands of women over the decades. But more than any physical legacy, what Patrick and Grace left behind was a story about courage and love, about standing up for what is right even when it is hard, about taking chances on people and possibilities. A story about how one moment of choice, one decision to stop and help instead of walking away, can change everything. It was a story that their descendants told and retold, each generation adding their own details and interpretations, but always coming back to the core truth, that Grace and Patrick found each other at exactly the right moment, that they built something beautiful from desperate circumstances, and that their love was strong enough to last a lifetime and beyond. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew across the grasslands and the mountains turned purple in the fading light, people swore they could still feel their presence on that land. 2 souls who had found freedom and love and home together.